General Douglas MacArthur once declared that the war in the Pacific would be won not by battleships, but by mastery of the air and sea together. Yet even he could not have predicted the weapon that would transform those waters into a killing field. What aircraft could annihilate an entire convoy before its guns could even track their attackers? What tactics turned supply lines into funeral processions, leaving survivors to whisper that the ocean had become a crematorium? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. March 3rd, 1943. The Bismarck Sea, dark and restless under tropical clouds. On the bridge of destroyer Shikinami, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura surveyed his formation with quiet satisfaction. 16 vessels stretched across the water in disciplined columns. 8 transports heavy with troops destined for New Guinea. 8 warships to shield them. Nearly 7,000 soldiers packed below decks, the lifeblood of a garrison that would otherwise wither and die. This was more than a convoy. This was survival itself. Yet across that same water, another force gathered. Major Paul Gunn leaned forward in the cockpit of his modified A-20 Havoc, eyes scanning the horizon through breaks in the cloud cover. His aircraft was no ordinary bomber. From its nose protruded 850 caliber machine guns, a wall of firepower that could shred metal like paper. Behind him flew dozens more, each carrying the same brutal armament. Intelligence had whispered the convoy's position. Reconnaissance had confirmed it. Now the hunters descended with a fury that no amount of steel plating could withstand. 15 minutes. That was the span between Kimura's confidence and his catastrophe. 15 minutes between order and chaos, between a fleet and a graveyard. 15 minutes in which the rules of naval warfare were rewritten, not by admirals, but by pilots who had learned to kill at wave height. Kimura gripped the rail of his bridge. Gunn's finger hovered over the trigger. The sea churned below, indifferent to the violence about to unfold. Steel against gunfire, discipline against innovation, predator against predator. Only one would survive. And in those 15 minutes, the balance of the Pacific would shift forever. The Pacific War was not a single conflict, but a sprawling nightmare across 10,000 islands and 1,000,000 square miles of ocean. By early 1943, the contest had settled into a brutal rhythm. Japan held the interior lines, a vast perimeter stretching from Burma to the Solomons. Australia and America pushed back from the edges, island by island, atoll by atoll. Each advance cost blood, each supply line stretched thinner. And at the heart of it all lay New Guinea, a festering wound where neither side could gain the upper hand. For Japan, New Guinea represented more than territory. It was the anchor of their southern defense, the shield protecting the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the gateway to Australia itself. Lose New Guinea, and the entire strategic architecture of the co-prosperity sphere would collapse. The Japanese understood this with desperate clarity. They poured troops into Rabaul, Lae, and Salamaua, transforming jungle outposts into fortified bastions. But soldiers without supplies were merely mouths waiting to starve. Ammunition, food, medicine, all of it had to cross the sea. And the sea had become a graveyard. American submarines prowled the depths, silent killers that struck without warning. Surface raiders harassed the coasts, but the true revolution was happening in the air. General George Kinney, commander of the 5th Air Force, had arrived in the Southwest Pacific with a mandate to win the war with what he had. What he had was not nearly enough. His bombers were too few, his fighters outranged by Japanese Zeros, his logistics a patchwork of scavenged parts and improvisation. But Kenny was not a man who accepted limitations. He was a man who rewrote them. The problem he faced was elemental. Heavy escort, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Traditional level bombing from high altitude was a gamble. Bombs fell in patterns, scattered by wind and error. A destroyer could turn, a transport could zigzag, and entire bomb loads would vanish into empty water. Even when hits were scored, a single bomb might only wound a ship, leaving it limping but alive. The enemy adapted quickly, sailing at night, hugging coastlines, timing their movements to evade patrol schedules. For every convoy sunk, 2 more slipped through. Guinea needed a weapon that did not rely on luck. He needed precision, concentration, overwhelming violence delivered so quickly that the enemy had no time to react. The answer, he believed, lay not in bombing from above, but in attacking from the surface itself. If aircraft could descend to wave height and strafe for ship's length with concentrated fire, they could shred superstructures, ignite fuel, slaughter crews, and turn steel vessels into floating pyres before anyone aboard could mount an effective defense. This was not a new idea. Strafing had been attempted before with limited success. Fighters carried machine guns, but their ammunition loads were modest, their staying power brief. What Guinea envisioned required something different. He needed aircraft that could carry the firepower of a light cruiser and deliver it with the speed of a diving hawk. He needed a weapon that could kill not by chance, but by design. And so he turned to a man who shared his obsession with unorthodox solutions. Major Paul Gunn was not a typical officer. Before the war, he had been a civilian pilot in the Philippines, flying mail routes and cargo runs across the islands. When Japan invaded, he stayed behind, smuggling refugees and supplies under enemy noses until the last moment. By the time he reached Australia, he had seen too much death to care about protocol. He joined the 5th Air Force not to follow orders, but to settle accounts. Guinea recognized in Gunn a kindred spirit, someone who saw rules as suggestions, and aircraft as raw material waiting to be transformed. Gunn's workshop in Townsville became a laboratory of violence. He took A-20 Havoc attack bombers, sleek twin-engine machines designed for light bombing and reconnaissance, and gutted them. Out came the bomb bays. Out came the standard nose armament. In their place, Gunn installed 850 caliber Browning machine guns, all fixed to fire forward in a single devastating cone of lead. The modification was brutal in its simplicity. The A-20 was fast, maneuverable, and now it carried enough firepower to saw a ship in half. But the guns were only part of the equation. Guinea and Gunn developed a tactic to match the weapon, something they called skip bombing. The concept was audacious. Instead of releasing bombs from high altitude, aircraft would approach at masthead height, racing across the water at full throttle. At the last moment, they would release delayed fuse bombs that skipped across the surface like stones, slamming into the hull below the waterline before detonating. It was dangerous, requiring pilots to fly straight into the teeth of enemy fire. But when it worked, it was devastating. Ships had armor on their decks and sides. They had almost none at the waterline. Combine skip bombing with strafing, and the result was a new form of warfare. First, the Strafers would sweep in, their masked machine guns raking decks, destroying gun crews, igniting anything flammable, creating chaos and panic. Then, while the defenders reeled, the skip bombers would follow, punching holes beneath the surface, flooding compartments, breaking keels. Finally, more Strafers would circle back, finishing off anything still afloat. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Guinea began training his squadrons in these tactics throughout late 1942 and early 1943. Pilots practiced low-level approaches over the Australian coast, skimming waves until spray lashed their windscreens. They learned to judge distance by instinct, to release ordnance in the split second before collision seemed inevitable. They learned to trust their machines, to push throttles to the limits.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ignore the tracers that would inevitably claw toward them. Most of all, they learned to think like hunters. A convoy was not a target to be bombed. It was prey to be cornered, exhausted, and torn apart. The Japanese, for their part, remained confident. They had faced American air power before and survived. Their anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, layered with light and heavy guns, coordinated by experienced crews. Their warships sailed in protective screens, ready to throw up walls of flak. They believed, with the certainty born of tradition, that no aircraft could survive a sustained approach at low altitude. The mathematics seemed obvious. A plane flying low and straight was a clay pigeon. It would be shot down long before it could inflict meaningful damage. What they did not understand was that the Americans had stopped playing by the old rules. Kenny was not interested in trading losses for marginal gains. He was interested in annihilation. His modified A-20s were not individual raiders. They were components of a system, a coordinated killing machine that struck with such speed and ferocity that defense became impossible. The Japanese prepared for a battle. What they would face instead was a massacre. By March 1943, intelligence networks across the Pacific hummed with whispers. Japanese radio traffic increased. Transport schedules shifted. Reconnaissance flights spotted unusual activity around Rabaul, the fortress harbor that served as Japan's nerve center in the region. Something was coming. Kenny's analysts pieced together fragments, cross-referencing sightings with decoded signals, and gradually a picture emerged. A large convoy was forming, larger than usual, carrying reinforcements critical to the defense of Leh. If it reached its destination, the Japanese garrison would be resupplied, reinforced, and capable of holding out for months. The offensive momentum in New Guinea would stall. Kenny called his squadron commanders together. The briefing was blunt. A convoy was coming through the Bismarck Sea, likely within days. It would be heavily escorted, well-armed, and sailing under the assumption that American forces lacked the strength to stop it. That assumption, Kenny said with a thin smile, was about to be corrected. Every available aircraft would be committed. Strafers, skip bombers, conventional bombers, fighters, everything. The goal was not to damage the convoy. The goal was to erase it. The pilots understood what was being asked. This would not be a surgical strike. It would be a sustained assault, wave after wave, until nothing remained afloat. Some of them would not return, but if they succeeded, the Japanese logistics chain in New Guinea would be shattered. The enemy would learn that the sea was no longer a highway. It was a trap. Across the Bismarck Sea, Rear Admiral Kimura prepared his own ships for departure. He was a veteran of many crossings, a cautious man who trusted in discipline and preparation. His convoy was a formidable assembly. 8 transports, each laden with soldiers and supplies. 8 escorts, including 4 destroyers and 4 smaller warships. Nearly 7,000 men depended on his decisions. He plotted a course that hugged the northern coast of New Britain, staying close to land where air cover from Rabaul could reach if needed. He scheduled the crossing to take advantage of poor weather, knowing that clouds were a convoy's best defense against aerial attack. Everything that could be done had been done. Kimura had sailed these waters before. He had evaded American patrols, weathered air raids, delivered his charges safely to port. There was no reason to believe this voyage would be different. The Americans were dangerous, yes, but they were also overstretched, their resources finite, their aircraft aging. A convoy of this size, this well defended, would not be an easy target. It might not be a target at all. He stood on the bridge of Shikinami as the formation assembled in Rabaul's harbor. Around him, the sea was crowded with steel. Transports rode low in the water, heavy with humanity. Destroyers cut sharp lines through the swell, their crews alert
And ready. Above, clouds gathered in thick masses, promising concealment. The weather was on their side. Fate Kimura allowed himself to believe, was on their side. He gave the order. Engines churned. Wakes appeared. One by one, the ships filed out of the harbor and turned northwest, heading into the open sea. Behind them, Rabaul faded into mist. Ahead lay the crossing, 2 days of vigilance and tension before reaching the safety of Leh. Kimura settled into the rhythm of command, watching, waiting, trusting that preparation and discipline would see them through. He did not know that far to the south, reconnaissance aircraft had already spotted his formation. He did not know that coordinates were being radioed back to Australian bases. He did not know that Major Paul Gunn was climbing into the cockpit of his modified A-20, checking his guns, running through pre-flight routines with the calm focus of a man who had done this 100 times before. He did not know that an entire air armada was fueling, arming, preparing to launch at dawn. 15 minutes. That was all the time his convoy would have once the attack began. 15 minutes between the first sighting and the last ship sinking. 15 minutes in which the ocean would transform from a passage into a crematorium. But for now, as the sun set over the Bismarck Sea and the convoy sailed on through gathering darkness, Kimura allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had made it through the first night. Tomorrow, they would be closer to safety. Tomorrow, the Strafers would come. The night passed slowly for both sides. On the Japanese transports, soldiers huddled in the stifling holds, trying to sleep despite the roll of the ship and the suffocating heat. Many of them were replacements, fresh troops who had never seen combat, sent to bolster the garrison at Leh. They trusted in the steel around them, in the destroyers circling like guard dogs, in the officers who assured them that the crossing would be routine. Above decks, gun crews manned their stations in shifts, eyes scanning the darkness for shadows that never came. The convoy moved through the night undisturbed, a slow procession of darkened shapes cutting through black water. Kimura remained on the bridge, sleeping in brief intervals, waking to check positions and weather reports. The clouds had thickened as predicted, a low ceiling that would make air reconnaissance difficult. By dawn, they would be well into the crossing, close enough to land that Japanese fighters from Rabaul could provide cover if needed. Everything was proceeding as planned. Yet something gnawed at him, a formless unease that veterans learned to recognize. The sea was too quiet, the night too empty. It felt less like safety and more like the calm before violence. At airfields across northern Australia and New Guinea, a different kind of preparation unfolded. Ground crews worked through the darkness, loading ammunition belts into the modified A-20s. Each aircraft received thousands of rounds, enough to sustain fire for extended bursts. The .50 caliber Brownings were checked, rechecked, their mechanisms tested until they cycled smoothly. Skip bombs were fitted with delayed fuses, each one calibrated to detonate seconds after impact, giving them time to penetrate below the waterline. Fuel tanks were topped off, engines were warmed. Pilots gathered in briefing tents, studying maps and photographs, memorizing the formation patterns of Japanese convoys, reviewing attack sequences until they could recite them in their sleep. Convoy had been spotted steaming northwest along the coast of New Britain. By dawn, it would be far from any safe harbor, isolated in open water. Kenny's plan called for a coordinated assault. B-17 flying fortresses would strike first from high altitude, not to sink ships, but to force them to scatter, breaking their defensive formation. Then the modified A-20s would come in low, strafers first to suppress anti-aircraft fire, followed by skip bombers to deliver killing blows. P-38 Lightnings would fly top cover, intercepting any Japanese fighters that tried to interfere. Wave after wave would hammer the convoy until nothing remained. It was a plan born of desperation and audacity. The 5th Air Force had never attempted an operation on this scale.
coordinating dozens of aircraft from multiple bases, timing their arrivals to strike in sequence, maintaining cohesion over hundreds of miles of ocean. All of it depended on precision and luck. If the weather turned, if the convoy altered course, if Japanese fighters arrived in force, the entire operation could collapse into chaos. But Kenny had staked his reputation on this moment. He believed in his crews, in his modified aircraft, in the tactics they had drilled endlessly. This was the test. Either the new methods would prove themselves, or they would fail spectacularly. As the first light of dawn crept across the eastern horizon, engines roared to life. One by one, the aircraft taxied onto runways and lifted into the dim morning sky. Gunn's A-20 climbed steadily, the weight of its guns and ammunition pulling at the airframe. Around him, the formation assembled, a swarm of predators rising into the clouds. They flew north, navigation guided by dead reckoning and instinct, following the coast until the Bismarck Sea opened before them. On the convoy below, lookouts spotted the first glimmers of daylight reflecting off distant wings. Alarm sounded. Gun crews scrambled to their stations. Kimura raised his binoculars and felt his stomach tighten. The sky was filling with aircraft, more than he had expected, more than he had feared. He barked orders into the voice tube. All ships were to increase speed, tighten formation, prepare for evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft batteries swiveled upward, tracking the approaching bombers. High above, the B-17s leveled off and opened their bomb bays. From 20,000 feet, the convoy looked like toys scattered on a pond. Bombardiers squinted through their sights, adjusting for wind and speed. The bombs fell in clusters, spinning down through thin air, and for a long moment there was only the whistle of their descent. Then the sea erupted. Columns of water shot skyward, towering geysers that drenched the nearest ships. Most of the bombs missed, as expected, but the effect was immediate. The convoy scattered. Ships turned hard, breaking formation, each captain now focused on individual survival rather than collective defense. The protective screen dissolved. Gaps appeared between vessels. Kimura shouted into the radio, trying to restore order, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Transports wallowed as they turned, their heavy cargo making them sluggish. Destroyers accelerated, racing to reposition, but the formation was already fragmenting. And through the smoke and spray, descending like falcons, came the Strafers. Gunn nosed his A-20 down, throttle wide open, the altimeter unwinding as the ocean rushed up to meet him. Behind him, a dozen more Strafers followed in a loose line, each pilot watching the plane ahead, waiting for the moment to open fire. The convoy spread below, ships turning in every direction, guns beginning to flash. Tracers arced upward, bright lines scratching the sky. The air filled with steel, a curtain of flak and machine gun fire that seemed impenetrable. But Gunn did not flinch. He leveled off just above the wave tops, so low that spray misted his windscreen. Directly ahead, a transport loomed, its deck crowded with soldiers and cargo. He could see faces turning toward him, mouths opening in shock. His finger tightened on the trigger. 850 caliber machine guns roared as one, a continuous thunder that shook the entire airframe.
The cone of fire was enormous, a solid stream of lead that converged on the transport's superstructure. Metal disintegrated. The bridge windows shattered. Men were flung backward, torn apart by impacts they never saw coming. Deck cargo exploded, crates splintering, fuel drums rupturing. Fires ignited instantly, spreading across tarps and rigging. Gunn held the trigger down, walking his fire along the ship's length, from bow to stern, a sustained burst that lasted seconds but felt eternal. When he finally released, pulling up sharply to avoid the mast, the transport was already dying. Flames poured from a dozen wounds. Bodies lay scattered across twisted metal. The ship staggered, losing way, black smoke pouring into the sky. Behind Gunn, the next strafer arrived, and the next, and the next. Each one unleashed its own torrent of fire, targeting different ships, shredding decks, killing gun crews, igniting anything that could burn. The volume of fire was overwhelming.
Japanese anti-aircraft gunners tried to track the low-flying attackers, but they were too fast, too close, too many. A gunner would swing his weapon toward one aircraft, only to be cut down by another, coming from a different angle. Within minutes, the convoy's defensive fire slackened. Half the gun crews were dead or wounded. The survivors crouched behind shattered shields, too terrified to expose themselves. Then came the skip bombers. Modified B-25 Mitchells roared in at wave height, their bomb bays open, pilots flying with a precision born of endless practice. At the last possible moment, they released their ordnance. The bombs tumbled forward, kissed the water, skipped once, twice, and slammed into hulls just below the waterline. The delayed fuses gave them time to penetrate deep before detonating. When they exploded, the effect was catastrophic. Steel plates buckled inward, compartments flooded, ships that had survived strafing now took mortal wounds, water pouring in faster than pumps could manage. One transport, already burning from strafer attacks, took a skip bomb amidships. The explosion tore open her engine room. She lurched to a stop, settling rapidly by the stern. Soldiers poured onto the deck, some leaping into the water, others frozen in panic. A second bomb hit moments later, sealing her fate. She rolled onto her side and sank within minutes, taking hundreds down with her. A destroyer tried to maneuver, racing toward the attackers with guns blazing, determined to fight back. But a strafer caught her broadside, raking her length with concentrated fire. The bridge crew was annihilated. Torpedo tubes exploded. The destroyer spun in a circle, out of control, until a skip bomber finished her with a bomb through her keel. She broke in half and went down in less than a minute. Kimura watched from Shikinami's bridge in numb horror. His carefully organized convoy was disintegrating. Ships burned in every direction. The sea was thick with debris and struggling men. Oil slicks spread like black blood, igniting in patches, turning the water itself into flame. He tried to coordinate a defense, to rally his remaining warships, but there was no defense against this. The Americans were not attacking, they were slaughtering. Another transport exploded, ammunition stores cooking off in a chain reaction that tore her apart. A tanker, loaded with aviation fuel, took a skip bomb and erupted in a fireball so intense that aircraft 1,000 feet away felt the heat. The explosion sent a mushroom cloud rising into the sky, visible for miles. Men in the water screamed as burning fuel washed over them. 15 minutes had passed since the first strafer attacked. In that quarter hour, the convoy had been shattered. 8 transports were sinking or already gone. 4 escorts were dead in the water or capsizing. Kimura's flagship still floated, but she was isolated, surrounded by wreckage and death. The admiral stood frozen, unable to process the scale of the disaster. This was not supposed to happen. Convoys did not simply vanish, yet his had. The strafers circled back for another pass, their ammunition not yet exhausted. They swept through the smoke, finishing off anything still afloat,
showing signs of life. A crippled transport that had been listing heavily took another burst of fire and rolled over completely. A destroyer trying to limp away was struck by yet another skip bomb and exploded. The ocean had become a killing field, littered with shattered steel and dying men. Kenny's coordination had worked flawlessly. Each wave of attackers had arrived exactly when needed, overwhelming the defenses before they could recover, compounding damage upon damage until nothing could survive. The Japanese had been given no time to adapt, no opportunity to regroup. From the moment the first strafer dove to the moment the last bomb hit, they had been trapped in a nightmare of fire and metal, helpless against an assault unlike anything they had ever faced. By the time the American aircraft turned for home, fuel and ammunition exhausted, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. 12 ships had sailed that morning. 12 ships now rested on the bottom or were sinking fast. Thousands of men floated in the water, clinging to debris, their cries echoing across the empty ocean. Some would be rescued by submarines or fishing boats in the days to come. Most would not. The sea was unforgiving, and their survivors had only their memories to sustain them as they waited for death or deliverance. Kimura remained on Shikinami's bridge, staring at the carnage. His convoy was gone. His mission had failed. Around him, his remaining crew worked frantically to save what few survivors they could pull from the water, but there were too many, spread too far. The magnitude of the loss was incomprehensible. In 15 minutes, an entire operation had been annihilated. In 15 minutes, the rules of naval warfare had changed forever. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning clouds, the full extent of the disaster became visible. Oil fires still burned on the surface, debris fields stretched for miles, bodies drifted among the wreckage. And in the distance, flying south toward their bases, the American aircraft faded into specks, their work complete. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken. 15 minutes to sink a fleet, 15 minutes to rewrite history. And in those 15 minutes, the Japanese had learned a truth they would carry for the rest of the war. The sea was no longer theirs. The sky was no longer neutral. And the Americans had found a way to kill that no amount of courage or tradition could withstand. The silence that followed was more terrible than the roar of combat. Where minutes before the air had been filled with engines and explosions and screaming metal, now there was only the gentle slap of waves against wreckage and the distant cries of men scattered across miles of ocean. The American aircraft had vanished southward, their fuel gauges dropping, their ammunition exhausted, leaving behind a scene of devastation so complete that even the attackers themselves struggled to comprehend what they had accomplished. Major Paul Gunn flew in formation with his squadron, his hands steady on the controls, but his mind replaying every moment of the attack. He had flown combat missions before, had strafed enemy positions and bombed supply depots, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer totality of what had just occurred. Entire ships had simply ceased to exist. Others had transformed from functional vessels into twisted pyres in the span of seconds. The weight of 8 50-caliber machine guns firing in unison had been extraordinary, a sustained thunder that rattled bones and blurred vision. And the effect on the targets had been apocalyptic. As the Australian coast appeared on the horizon, Gunn allowed himself a moment of reflection. The modified A-20s had performed beyond even his optimistic projections. The concentrated firepower had not just damaged ships, but eviscerated them, stripping away defenses so completely that follow-up attacks faced almost no resistance. The tactic of wave coordination, strafers followed by skip bombers, followed by more strafers, had worked, with a precision that seemed almost surgical, despite its brutal nature. Yet beneath the satisfaction of a mission accomplished lay something darker. He had just participated in the methodical destruction of thousands of human beings. Soldiers who had boarded those transports believing they were sailing to reinforce their comrades. Sailors who had trusted in their ships and their commanders, all of them now dead or dying in water stained with oil and blood. War demanded such calculations. Gunn knew this. Every one of those soldiers not killed today would have fought against American and Australian forces at Lae. Every ship not sunk would have carried more reinforcements, prolonging the campaign, costing more lives on both sides. The arithmetic was cold, but undeniable. Still, the images lingered. The faces turning toward his aircraft in the instant before the guns opened fire. The figures thrown into the air like dolls when bullets found them. The ship that had rolled over, spilling hundreds into the sea. He pushed the thoughts aside. There would be time for reflection later. Now there was only the flight home. Back at the airfield, ground crews waited anxiously. They had counted the aircraft departing, and now they counted them returning. The losses were remarkably light. A handful of planes damaged by anti-aircraft fire, none shot down. As each aircraft touched down and taxied to its revetment, pilots climbed out with expressions ranging from exhilaration to exhaustion to something approaching shock. They gathered in small groups, talking rapidly, gesturing, trying to process what they had witnessed. Intelligence officers moved among them with notepads, gathering reports, cross-referencing observations, building a picture of the battle. General George Kenney arrived within the hour, driven by a need to hear first-hand accounts before official reports could sanitize them. He found Gunn standing beside his A-20,
running a hand along the nose where carbon scoring marked the spots where gun barrels had heated metal to discoloration. The two men exchanged a look that needed no words. Kenny's gamble had paid off. The modified strafers had performed exactly as promised. The tactics had worked, the coordination had held, and the results spoke for themselves. "Tell me," Kenny said quietly. Gunn took a breath before answering. 12 ships. All of them. The transports are gone. Most of the escorts, too. The convoy is finished. Kenny nodded slowly, absorbing the magnitude. His Air Force had just accomplished something that admirals with entire fleets might have struggled to achieve. A major enemy convoy had been annihilated, not in a day-long battle, but in a quarter of an hour. The implications were staggering. Within hours, reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what the attack pilots had reported. The Bismarck Sea was littered with debris. Lifeboats and rafts drifted aimlessly. Oil slicks stretched for miles. A few destroyers and smaller vessels remained afloat, picking up survivors where they could. But the convoy itself had ceased to exist as a functional entity. Photographic evidence showed capsized hulls, burning wrecks, and empty water where once 16 ships had sailed in formation. The intelligence analysts tallied the losses with grim efficiency. 8 transports destroyed. 4 destroyers sunk. Thousands of troops killed before ever reaching the battlefield. Tons of supplies and equipment now resting on the ocean floor. The Japanese garrison at Lae would receive no reinforcement. The offensive capability of enemy forces in New Guinea had been crippled in a single stroke. The news rippled outward through Allied command structures. In Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur received the initial reports with characteristic skepticism, demanding confirmation and reconfirmation before accepting that an entire convoy had been destroyed by air attack alone. When the photographic evidence arrived, he studied the images in silence, then called for Kenny. The two men had clashed before, over resources and priorities, but in that moment, MacArthur offered something rare from him: unqualified praise. What Kenny's airmen
had accomplished represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese could no longer move large forces by sea without risking total loss. Supply lines that had sustained their garrisons were now death traps. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff absorbed the news with a mixture of elation and recalibration. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it was quickly named, demonstrated capabilities that had been theoretical until now. Strategic planners began revising their assessments of what air power could achieve against maritime targets. Budget allocations shifted, production priorities changed. More strafer modifications were authorized, more pilots were trained in low-level attack techniques. The success in the Bismarck Sea became a template, a proof of concept that would be applied across the Pacific theater. But nowhere was the impact more immediate than in New Guinea itself. The Japanese forces at Lae, who had been awaiting the convoy with desperate hope, received word of the disaster with disbelief that turned to despair. 7,000 reinforcements would not be arriving. Food stocks would not be replenished. Ammunition reserves would not be expanded. The garrison was now isolated, cut off, expected to hold indefinitely with resources that were already stretched thin. Morale, which had been sustained by the promise of relief, collapsed. Soldiers who had believed they were part of a larger strategy now understood they had been abandoned to their fate. The psychological impact reverberated beyond Lae. Every Japanese garrison in New Guinea suddenly grasped their vulnerability. Supply convoys had always been risky, but they had been possible. Ships had been sunk before, but convoys had also gotten through. Now there was a new calculus. A single concentrated air attack could obliterate an entire formation before it had time to scatter. The sea routes that connected the scattered outposts were no longer highways, but gauntlets that few would survive. Commanders began hoarding supplies, rationing more severely, preparing for prolonged sieges. The offensive posture that had characterized Japanese operations gave way to defensive attrition. In Tokyo, the news arrived like a thunderclap. The Naval General Staff convened emergency sessions to analyze what had gone wrong. How had an entire convoy been destroyed so quickly? What tactics had the Americans employed? Could they be countered? Initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Survivors spoke of aircraft coming in at wave height, of concentrated machine gun fire that shredded everything in its path, of bombs that skipped across the water to strike below the waterline. It sounded fantastical, like exaggeration born of trauma. But as more accounts arrived, a coherent picture emerged. The Americans had developed a new method of attack, one that bypassed traditional defenses and delivered overwhelming violence before any response was possible.
They could simply overwhelm defenses with coordinated waves. Fighter escorts could be assigned, but Japan's fighter forces were already stretched thin, and the Americans had demonstrated air superiority over contested zones. Every solution proposed had drawbacks that might make the situation worse rather than better. In the end, Japanese naval strategy shifted towards smaller, faster vessels that could evade detection and scatter quickly if attacked. Large convoys were abandoned in favor of trickles of supply, individual ships and submarines running at night, accepting higher per-unit risk in exchange for lower aggregate losses. It was an admission of defeat in all but name. The sea lines of communication that were supposed to connect and sustain Japan's far-flung empire were now contested to the point of uselessness. Garrisons that could not be supplied would eventually starve or be overrun. The defensive perimeter was contracting not because of ground combat, but because the ocean itself had become impassable. For the men who had survived the attack, the trauma was profound and lasting. Japanese sailors, pulled from the water by their own destroyers, sat in shock, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing. Many had watched their ships disintegrate around them. Others had seen comrades torn apart by gunfire or drowned in flooded compartments. The psychological impact of such sudden, overwhelming violence could not be easily processed. Some became catatonic, others wept uncontrollably. A few simply refused to speak as if language had become inadequate to describe what they had experienced. Those who did speak told stories that were almost uniform in their horror. The aircraft had appeared without warning, screaming out of low cloud cover at impossible speeds. There had been no time to react, no opportunity to mount an organized defense. One moment, the convoy was sailing in formation. The next, ships were exploding and burning. Survivors described the sound of machine gun fire as a continuous roar, like thunder that never ended, and the visual impact of concentrated tracers as streams of light that seemed to solidify the air itself. When the bullet struck metal, the noise was indescribable, a shrieking cacophony of impacts layered one upon another until individual sounds merged into a sustained scream. The water had offered no refuge. Men who jumped overboard to escape burning ships found themselves swimming through oil slicks that ignited, turning the sea into a field of flame. Others were caught in the suction of sinking vessels, dragged down into darkness. Still others simply floated, too injured or exhausted to swim, waiting for rescue that might never come. Japanese destroyers and smaller craft picked up what survivors they could, but the scale of the disaster meant that hundreds, perhaps thousands, were left behind. Some would drift for days before being found. Many would never be found at all. Rear Admiral Kimura survived the battle, but not with his reputation intact. He was rescued from the water after Shikinami was sunk by follow-up attacks, pulled aboard a smaller escort vessel that managed to limp back to Rabaul. When he arrived, he faced immediate interrogation by superior officers who demanded explanations. How had an entire convoy been destroyed? Why had defensive measures failed? What could have been done differently? Kimura had no satisfying answers. The attack had been too fast, too concentrated, too unlike anything anticipated by doctrine or training. He had commanded according to established procedures, and those procedures had proven utterly inadequate.
He was not court-martialed, but neither was he given another convoy command. The loss had been too catastrophic, the failure too visible. He spent the remainder of the war in staff positions, analyzing convoy routes and defensive strategies, contributing to the shift away from large formations toward dispersed movements. But the shadow of the Bismarck Sea never left him. In later years, when historians interviewed surviving Japanese officers, Kimura spoke with the loss as a turning point in the war.
Quiet bitterness about the battle. The Americans had changed the rules, he said. They had found a way to kill that made traditional naval warfare obsolete. We were not defeated by superior seamanship or gunnery. We were annihilated by a method we did not understand until it was too late. The broader strategic consequences of the battle unfolded over the following months. The Japanese garrison at Leh, deprived of reinforcement and resupply, withered. Australian and American forces pressed their offensive, slowly encircling the position, cutting off what few supply routes remained. By September 1943, Leh fell. The soldiers who had waited for a convoy that never arrived either died in the final assault or surrendered, hollow-eyed and starving. The loss of Leh opened the door to further Allied advances along the New Guinea coast, each one pushing Japanese forces further back, each one made possible because the sea routes that should have sustained the defenders had been closed by air power. Other Japanese convoys attempted to reach New Guinea in the months following the Bismarck Sea disaster, but they did so with the knowledge that they might share the same fate. Captains sailed with heightened anxiety, scanning the skies constantly, ordering crash dives at the first sign of aircraft. Some convoys scattered preemptively when reconnaissance planes appeared, abandoning formation discipline in favor of individual survival. Others turned back rather than risk annihilation. The cumulative effect was a logistics crisis that spread across the entire theater. Supplies that should have reached frontline units instead piled up in rear bases or sat on docks awaiting transport that commanders were reluctant to authorize. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also marked a turning point in American confidence. Prior to March 1943, the Pacific War had been characterized by hard-fought, incremental gains, each island and each mile of ocean contested with heavy losses. Now, suddenly, there was a sense that the tide had shifted irreversibly. If an entire convoy could be destroyed in 15 minutes, what else might be possible? The success emboldened planners to propose more aggressive operations, to shorten timelines, to take risks that would have seemed reckless only months before. The psychological advantage shifted. American forces began to believe they were not just fighting to survive, but fighting to win. Kenny's reputation soared. He had proven that unorthodox thinking could produce results that conventional methods could not match. His willingness to modify aircraft, to experiment with tactics, to trust in the ingenuity of men like Paul Gunn had paid dividends that reverberated throughout the command structure. Other theaters began adopting similar approaches, modifying their own aircraft, training their own pilots in low-level attack techniques. The Strafer concept spread from the Southwest Pacific to the Central Pacific to the China-Burma-India theater, eventually influencing tactical doctrine across the entire war effort. For Gunn himself, the battle brought recognition, but also a certain weariness. He continued flying missions, continued modifying aircraft, continued pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible. But the weight of what he had helped create never entirely left him. Years later, in interviews, he spoke carefully about the Bismarck Sea. He acknowledged the tactical brilliance, the coordination, the effectiveness of the modified Strafers. But he also spoke about the human cost, not just to the Japanese, but to the men who had flown the missions. Some of his pilots never fully recovered from what they had seen and done.
the act of strafing at close range, of watching men die under concentrated fire, of seeing ships full of human beings torn apart, left scars that victory parades could not erase. The legacy of the battle extended beyond the immediate tactical and strategic consequences. It represented a broader truth about modern warfare, one that would echo through subsequent conflicts. Technology and innovation could shift the balance of power more rapidly than numbers or techniques.
Industrial output alone. A single new tactic, properly executed, could achieve results that entire fleets might struggle to match. The age of the battleship, already waning, received another blow. If aircraft could destroy convoys with such efficiency, what use were capital ships that took years to build and required enormous crews? The carriers that launched the Strafers were more valuable than the dreadnoughts that had once ruled the seas. Historians would later debate whether the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a turning point or simply a dramatic illustration of changes already underway. The argument was nuanced. Certainly, the Japanese position in New Guinea was deteriorating before the battle. Certainly, American air power was growing stronger with or without modified Strafers. But the sheer decisiveness of the engagement, the utter annihilation of a major convoy in such a short span, crystallized perceptions and accelerated processes that might otherwise have unfolded more gradually. It was both symptom and cause, evidence of American ascendancy and a contributor to it. In the immediate aftermath, propaganda on both sides seized on the battle for their own purposes. Allied news reports trumpeted the victory, emphasizing the skill of American and Australian airmen, the brilliance of the tactics, the completeness of the destruction. Newsreels showed footage of aircraft taking off, of bombs being loaded, of pilots giving thumbs-up signs, carefully edited to avoid showing the actual carnage. The message was clear. Allied forces were unstoppable, innovative, destined for victory. Public morale, which had been sustained through hard years by small victories and promises of eventual triumph, received a powerful boost. Japanese propaganda, conversely, downplayed the disaster. Initial reports claimed that the convoy had been attacked by overwhelming numbers and had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy before being forced to withdraw. Later, as the truth became impossible to conceal, the narrative shifted to emphasize the heroism of the sailors and soldiers who had fought to the last. The defeat was framed as a tragic but noble sacrifice, proof of Japanese spirit even in the face of superior enemy resources. What the propaganda could not hide, however, was the fact that a major reinforcement effort had failed utterly, leaving garrisons exposed and logistics in shambles. The technological lessons of the Bismarck Sea were absorbed quickly by both sides, but with different resources to implement them. The Americans accelerated production of modified attack aircraft and invested heavily in radar and coordination systems that allowed for the kind of multi-wave assaults that had proven so effective. Training programs emphasized low-level attack techniques and skip bombing, turning what had been experimental tactics into standard doctrine. By late 1943, entire squadrons were dedicated to anti-shipping strikes, their pilots drilled endlessly in the methods that had destroyed Kimura's convoy. The Japanese, lacking equivalent industrial capacity, focused on defensive adaptations. Convoys were broken up, ships sailed independently or in pairs. More emphasis was placed on submarine resupply, which was slower and less efficient but harder to detect and attack. Coastal defense networks were strengthened in an attempt to create safe corridors close to shore where air cover could be more readily provided. But these were reactive measures, attempts to mitigate a problem rather than solve it. The fundamental reality remained: Japan could no longer move large forces safely by sea in contested waters, and that limitation would only grow more severe as American air power expanded. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.